thank you for sticking in. This is a topic that is really close to my heart. We got two SANS Sec 555 instructors on here who does a tactical SIEM class, so I know I'm not the only one who's excited about this. So moving forward, a little bit about who I am. I'm a senior security researcher at Crowdstrike, and over the years, I've worked several different roles at several different companies, all of them through one form or another, whether that's proprietary, whether it's third party, whether it's open source, has used a SIEM. And I'm a little bit biased on my SIEM of choice, and some people would argue that Kibana isn't a full-blown SIEM, and that's fine. But that's where the majority of my experience is. Matter of fact, you'll see instructor on there. I taught for Elastic for about 1.5 years, teaching the US military to use Kibana for threat hunting, their networks. And so you'll notice that I have a slight lean towards that, but I'm trying to keep this fairly high level that'll work across multiple SIEMs. So, want to set the stage here for what we're not going to talk about. We're not going to talk about log ingestion. We're not going to talk about parsing or analysis of logs. We're not going to talk about some of the cool security features that Kibana has put in or Splunk has. We're going to keep it fairly agnostic. Now, if this were an in-person talk, one, I probably wouldn't have the audio issues I had, but two, I'd say, hey, we can talk about these things over a drink, right? Let's go grab a beer. Let's talk about data normalization. I think it's wildly important, just outside the scope of what we're talking about. Here's what we are going to talk about. We're just going to talk about general guidance on building and planning dashboards. So here's our agenda. We're going to take a look at an overview of dashboards and why we need them. We're going to talk about what I call, it's kind of a corny name, but pillars of dashboard excellence. These are some foundational things that we'll keep coming back to. Then we're going to talk about actually building the dashboards. What does that process look like? Talk about some quality of life improvements, some little nice to haves. And then I'll rant at the end, if we have time, about a few dashboard sins that I've seen and give some hot takes. So, dashboard overview. So you bought a SIEM, right? It doesn't matter which one it is. Some vendor somewhere said, hey, you need a SIEM and you need our SIEM. And to be fair, I think the first part of that is true. I think you do need a SIEM. You need to be ingesting this data into a single place where you can actually look at that, right? From a single pane of glass is kind of a marketing term, but you need a place to be able to go ask questions of your data. But now you have a pile of logs. What do you do with that? And that's kind of where that line is drawn. You have some really smart engineers that have gone in and said, great, we brought all these data sources into your SIEM, and now you just have a stack of them. And usually the barrier to entry on these is pretty high. And so, especially getting good information out of them. So let's dive into what happens next after you get one of these. You get given an empty search field. It says, enter your search here. And this is the hard part. This is where especially junior analysts, they don't know the fields, they don't know the values, they don't know the first thing about searching this data. And to be fair, some do it better than others. Splunk is in my opinion, pretty unforgiving, right? You get in there and you say, enter a search term. You say, well, great, I'll just punch a search button and it'll work. Not quite. You need to know some syntax to even get started with Splunk. So that one's a bit tough. Kibana is a little bit more forgiving. You can punch in an empty search, but either way, you're still going to learn this piece by piece by piece by piece. So of course, I'm asking a question. What's next? Usually when we ask questions in presentations, we fork to know the answers. And so my recommendation, of course, is going to be that we build dashboards. It's really important to know what type of dashboard we're going for here. You have several kinds. You have what I call exhibit dashboards. These are the pew-pew maps. These look great at the front of the SOC when you have customers coming in to look at it, or you have management coming in to see what's happening. What are they spending all this money on, right? Also looks good in stock photos of security. I don't find them particularly useful from an operational perspective. Now, the next one is a monitoring type dashboard. And this is usually meant to indicate that something is on fire, or that you're behind SLA, or that there's a queue that you're working, and it's meant to give you information at a certain time. So with those two out of the way, let's talk about my favorite and the one we're going to be focusing on here, actual operational dashboards. These are ones that are useful for deeper investigation taking leads or alerts from an environment, and then going and asking questions of your data. And with the focus on that, we need to talk about what is the purpose here? Why are we building these? It's pretty easy. We have one mission. We want to lower the barrier to asking questions of your data. You don't want a situation in which only your sharpest and brightest are asking questions of this data. You want everyone to be able to ask that. Because just because I've got years of experience with Kibana doesn't mean I'm going to ask the smartest questions. You're going to have people who know more about the source material that don't need to learn all the fields in your SIEM to ask good questions. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to lower that bar. There is a lot of turnover in SOCs typically due to burnout as well. And so the quicker you can get somebody in and give them a set of dashboards, the more effective your team is going to be. So next, we're going to move on to what I call the pillars of dashboards excellence. Little cheesy, I know, but it's an important piece. These are the guiding principles of what we're going to be talking about today. We want to make sure our dashboards are consistent. We want to make sure they're interconnected and that they're manageable. So with consistency, no matter what website you go to or software you're using, typically what's going to happen is no matter where you're at in that platform, there are going to be some guiding lights, some North Stars. So I have some examples of Amazon. I think they do a really good job of it. If I want to get back to Amazon's homepage, I know I can click in the top left at that little smile icon, and that'll get me back. I know my cart is always in the top right. And along the side there, or along the top, it allows me to navigate to different sections of the site. And so that's critical. And so we're going to strive for that. The next piece is interconnectivity. All SIEMs have a way to navigate dashboards, but they're usually pretty disjointed. It's usually hidden behind a hamburger menu, and you have to know what you're looking for. So we want to make this, this system of information kind of cohesive, right? So next up is manageability. I don't really have a screenshot for this, but as we think about developing these out and long-term, how easy is it going to be to manage these? And so we want to consider reusing elements, right? Maybe saving a specific element and using it on multiple dashboards. So when the time comes that we need to update that, we can update it in one place and it'll cascade through everything else. All right, next up, this is kind of the meat of the presentation. We're going to talk about actually building those dashboards. Now, if you've come here with pen and paper and you're like, great, I'm going to take down what buttons to click, what drop downs to select. I'm sorry, we don't have the bandwidth or the runway for that kind of discussion. That would also make it fairly specific to a platform. These can be high-level concepts, some of these you'll be able to apply to all SIEMs, others maybe only specific ones, but I think they're critical to take these steps to build it the right way. So first up, you want to build a dashboard. It's real easy to go to the dashboards menu and start working there. That's not what we're going to do. We're going to start by exploring the data. And you need somebody who really knows the underlying security principles of that platform. So if you're building AWS dashboards, you need somebody who knows AWS and CloudTrail. If you're building Windows, you need that, right? Maybe you're doing you're pulling in all your IDS alerts. You need somebody who knows those inside and out. And we're going to be sifting not only through raw logs, but also, let's say we find a field that's something like user type. Well, in this individual log, the value is IAM user. What I like to do is I like to have that raw log up, and then also another tab that has an aggregation view. And so I can say, man, that user type, I know this one is IAM user, but what are the other possibilities? So I can aggregate on that and say, great, not only is there IAM user, but there's also root, there's AWS service, assumed role, and we do that through everything, right? We kind of just take it apart and learn those logs. And what you're going to find is that most logs have a typical tiered hierarchical structure. And so in this case, we're going to focus on AWS. You have the log type called CloudTrail that runs across all the CloudTrail logs. Beneath that, you have event categories. Now, I know in the log itself it's called event source, but this is kind of that next tier, right? This is going to categorize it based on the service that you're using. So you have EC2 for your VMs, IAM for your identity, and then beneath that, you have individual event types or event names. And what you're going to find is there are going to be fields that span all of these, right? So something like event source or event name or timestamp or source IP address is going to be present in every single log. So we'll hang on to that data and think about that. Windows, for instance, is organized a little bit differently. Instead of having it broken up by service, you have different types of logs. So you have security, you have system, you have application. and then those break down into the individual event names a little bit lower down. So figure that out for whatever logs you're looking to build, and that'll inform this next step. The next step is building a navigation bar. This is a step that is fairly uncommon that I've seen across my instances of Kibana that I messed with, but this is going to add that cohesion to all of your dashboards. So instead of going to the dashboards menu and dropping down and searching through a ton of them, you're going to have an area that's going to allow you to pivot very quickly between your dashboards. This is probably the most important part. Now, building these is really, really easy. Most SIEMs have the ability to build a markdown widget. And this is going to allow you to put whatever text you want in there, and the syntax for a link is pretty simple. You put your text in brackets, this is what's displayed, and then in parentheses, you put the URL. And so that creates a link, and you'll just put whatever links you want there. Now, have the logs inform your decision on what you're breaking down, right? So for AWS, for instance, it's really easy for me to say, great, I'm going to use that second tier, those services, those are going to be where I build my dashboards up. So it's going to be different for everyone. One thing to consider, I would not include the IP address or the domain in these, whether it's running locally on your host. Very likely your VM is going to spin up one day, and DHCP is going to, or the hypervisor is going to hand that VM a different IP address. You don't have to go in and update those. Your domain, maybe it's managed by IT. IT, for a lot of reasons, moves infrastructure from one place to another. And so don't let that break all of your links. So usually what I do is I go a little bit past that domain, and for Kibana, you grab past that #, and then after Splunk, you grab after the port number. And so play around with that, figure out what works for your SIEM, but build it in a way where you're not having to go back and change this, right? Lean on that manageability piece. Dashboards are going to be laid out in different ways. Your nav bar should reflect that. And so, for instance, if you had only AWS data, your nav bar would be very simple. It'd be one bar across and have all your different services. So you click on overview, that takes you to your overview dashboard. IAM takes you to IAM, and so on. So it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Most SIEMs aggregate lots of different data types. So let's talk about how to build that. So what you'll want to do is you'll build what I consider to be a global nav bar. So you'll notice along the top there, you have a nav bar that has AWS, it has Azure, Office 365, Google Workspace, all along the top. That's going to be persistent everywhere. And if I click on any of those, it should take me to the overview dashboard of that particular data type. So what does that look like in practice? It's going to be pretty simple. All of your AWS dashboards are going to have your global nav bar and the AWS nav bar. All of your Azure is going to have the global and the Azure dashboard. Your Google Workspace is going to have the global and the Google Workspace. Excuse me, getting a little bit tongue-tied there. And what this does, the next slide should show it pretty easily here. It gives you the ability to navigate through those. These two nav bars contain 29 total dashboards. And it's not overwhelming, it's not a lot. As you change platforms, that bottom nav bar switches context. And so it's really, really nice, really easy to, and also really intuitive, which is what you want. So next up, we're going to finalize what I consider the header. Once again, we want that consistency across different platforms and different dashboards. And so there's no prescriptive method for this. You can set this up however you want. We'll go over some recommended widgets to put in here, but you want it to be the same no matter where we go. So once again, you can configure this however you want. These are the same 5 widgets reorganized in different ways. I'm not here to tell you where to put your title page or where to put your nav bar. That is totally up to you. I do have some recommendations for how you go about building this though. First up, set your screen to 1920 by 1080 and set your zoom to 100%. I'm sitting here with a 49-inch screen. If I expand out a Kibana dashboard and I build out a header and I design it to work with my desktop, what's going to happen when somebody opens that up on a laptop is they're going to curse my name every time. Everything's going to be squished. So make sure you build it universal for a standard screen size. Next up, for recommended elements, we want our title widget, and that's made out of Markdown as well. So that way, no matter where you navigate, you can look at a single place and know what dashboard you're on. You can also add additional context within that widget as well. Along with that, here's some other recommendations, maybe a count of records, maybe a little bar chart that shows the count of records over time, and maybe an aggregated view of event types, whatever works for you and your team, right? So keep in mind the header is going to be fairly generic fields that exist across all logs. So next up, we want to bake our filters into our dashboards. This diagram shows how most people build out visualizations, and it doesn't make it very scalable or very manageable. Most people say, great, I'm going to build a visualization, and I want my source to be the raw data or the raw index. And that is fine if you want to build it one time. You can very easily see here if for some reason our definition of maybe EC2 instance runs changes, or maybe our definition of IAM users or IAM events changes, I have to go to each visualization and change the filters and change the search. And that's simply not scalable. You're going to miss some, and what will likely happen is it'll fail silently. People use those dashboards for years and never know that they're getting the wrong data. So what do I recommend instead? I recommend building and saving a search. So you base it off of your raw data, it comes in, and you do all your filtering there. And then you use that search as the basis, as the source for all of your visualizations. So that way, when you need to make a change, you do it in one place, and it propagates throughout all of your visualizations. Elastic allows you to go in and choose different things. You'll notice all the little magnifying glass icons on here are going to indicate the searches that I've saved. So these are great starting places for that. The one at the bottom that's got a little graph, that's an index, that's raw data. Once again, that is not the right way to do it. You're going to apply those filters directly to the visualization, and you're going to have to update them all individually. So leverage those searches. Splunk, to be fair, does it the right way. It says, great, you want to build a visualization, choose your primary data source, and it makes you choose a search. Love it. I love the way they do that. It's highly scalable, and you'll thank yourself years down the road, or if somebody else has to take over and update it, they can do that in one place. All right, last but not least, we're finally building out our dashboards. And so we'll build our header that we've kind of agreed on. And once you build it once, you can clone that page and replace those widgets so that we're not having to size things. Once you build that out, then you start building widgets specific for that type of data. And so you're going through, you're looking at EC2 instances, and you're saying, great, what type of events am I dealing with? I'm dealing with run instances, terminate instances, dealing with security groups, right? All of that stuff, and you can build out individual widgets within here. And you notice my dashboards aren't very exciting. I love data tables. From an operational perspective, that's almost the only widget that I want. I don't need it flashy. It's not going up in front of the SOC. I need people to analyze the data, so I want to bring the data close to them. So when do I not use a data table? It's usually when I'm doing time series type things. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this slide, but just know that if you're going to do something over time, some type of bar or line chart is usually pretty well suited for this. Your bar chart's great for just giving us total aggregated numbers. Your line chart is really, really good at comparing one value to the other. Where the line chart struggles is showing overall spikes in values, right? And then the area, specifically a stacked area chart, I would use sparingly because it kind of misrepresents the data, especially if junior analysts are using this. They could look at this and say, hey, that purple value is spiked, it's way up there. But if you've used the stack area chart, you'll know that that's actually not where the spike is coming from. It's coming from the red values. This can be useful for things like NetFlow and data in, data out if you're using Zeek, but I would just use these sparingly. The stacked area, that is. The bar and the line, you're crazy, those are awesome. And let's bring back that markdown widget. These are great not only for titles and nav bars, but also for section headers. You can go in and say, hey, all these widgets right here, these 4 that I've built are just for run instances. And so you can visually break that up as you're going through it, and it makes it not just a sea of visualizations and data tables. So really, really handy there. So next up, we're going to add some quality of life adjustments to this. Let's go ahead and take a look. First, hyperlinks. So anytime you can reduce the amount of work that an analyst has to do to dive into a specific value, let's go ahead and do it. And so specifically what I've pointed out here is things like source hosts or source IP addresses. If you want to dive into that more, you have to copy that value and check it inside of some IP reputation, whether that's internal or external. So let's make that a one-click. How we can do that is There's often times in most SIEMs that you can go edit a field and you can change it from text to a URL. And typically they want some type of template. And so you need somewhere where there's a single value that you can change based on what's inside the log to complete the URL. So this Talus Intelligence is a great example. Everything is the same except for the last bit, which is a IP address. So we can enter that in, say, hey, in this last bit after the equal sign, let's go and put the value of this field in here. And so that makes it clickable, and it makes it really, really easy to pivot from from the dashboard to something external. But it's not only just for IP, right? We can use it for IP addresses, but we can also use it for things like Windows event IDs. And then most importantly, if we look back at Paul's talk yesterday, right? He pulled all the internal detections into Kibana. Well, those will have internal identification numbers, and if they pulled them in, it's proprietary. If you have a unique identifier, go ahead and look at that. Once again, we want to remove that barrier to deeper analysis. So we want to make that pivoting fairly seamless if we can. Next up, this is one of my favorites. I'm a big fan of Markdown widgets. You'll see I use them all over the place, but this is, I think, the most creative use of it. Whenever you put documentation on a wiki, that's where it goes to die, right? How many people can actually find things in their wiki? If you can, hit me up. Maybe I'll come work over there. I haven't seen it yet. Let's put it that way, right? So let's move that documentation out of a wiki and let's move it directly into the tool where you use it. And so that's what I've done here. So I've just created a Markdown wiki, or I'm sorry, Markdown widget, and it has all the information for things like AWS fields, things like example queries, frequently asked questions about the data itself. And so it's Markdown, so you can fully format it. And you'll notice that, I've changed my headers a little bit. I've changed it to reflect more of a wiki. So instead of having that nav bar along the top trying to populate all these different pages that I have, I moved that secondary nav bar over to the left-hand side. So my global still sits up there, but now I can navigate on the left-hand side. And of course, we're just navigating to entirely new dashboards, but they look the same. All right, last but not least, try to include your raw data in your dashboard. Not everywhere is going to let you do this, but for instance, in Kibana, if you save a search, you can actually just use that save search as a widget inside of your dashboard. And so what that allows you to do, filter on a value, instead of having to go to Discover or go to a raw SIEM search and look through all logs, you can actually include those right into your dashboard. So you're no longer having to go move to other sections of your SIEM. Not all of them do that, but wow, is that a huge help, because when we're building out these dashboards, you're deciding what values and what fields are important, but that's not all the fields that are available on that log. And so go ahead and make that easy for your analysts. All right, last but not least, dashboard SIEMs. I get to rant here a little bit. Got to be a little careful. I think somebody had some pie charts on the dashboard earlier, but we'll get to that. First up, inconsistent naming conventions, especially if you're architecting this. Try to be consistent with your naming conventions for widgets, for dashboards, for searches. It's going to make your life a lot easier in the long run. This is just an example I threw together, but this is what most Kibana instances look like when I get there. You've got weird capitalization. Sometimes you have dashes. Sometimes you have underscores. You get a lot of people's names in there. You have copies of dashboards. And so really slow down, take the time to name things in a way that not necessarily you remember, but you can navigate. So the way I do it, especially for visualizations, because you will have a lot of them, is you'll want to use platform dash whatever dashboard you're using, dash the name of the visualization, and then just for fun, I usually put the type of visualization in brackets. That's going to help you navigate that. So if you're on your, I don't know, Windows security logs, you can go in there and you can say, great, I need to add a visualization. You search for Windows, all of your Windows stuff comes up. You search for security, all your Windows security, it keeps filtering down. And you say, I know there's a bar chart I created. I don't remember what I called it. So you do Windows security bar and it pops right up to the top. Do yourself a favor, take the time. If you've already started this process and you realize, hey, I need to go back and rename it, it's a slog, but do it, it's worth it. All right, next up, one dashboard to rule them all. I think if anyone has started down this path of creating dashboards, they got really excited. I know I was like, great, I'm gonna create one dashboard. It's gonna have all my data. I'm gonna be able to come in here and say, hey, is this client or is my environment breached? And it's easy to get carried away with that. I wouldn't recommend putting tons of different data types on a single dashboard for a lot of reasons. The main one, though, is, in this case, I have some Azure compute, Azure or AWS storage and AWS compute. If I start filtering on this data, what happens is some of these widgets just go completely blank. And that's honestly a best case scenario. Where the real danger is when you start excluding certain types of data. Widgets don't behave in the way that you would expect them to. Let me put it that way. So it's a much more complicated conversation. Once again, if we were in person, I'd say, hey, let's talk about it over a beer, why it's so bad to mix and match these, but try to avoid that impulse. It's natural. I think everyone has it, especially when they start getting excited about dashboards. So last but not least, pie charts. This may be a controversial feeling, but especially from an operational perspective, I don't see a ton of value in pie charts. I'm going to try to make the case that we have better ways to visualize that same type of data. So especially if you have a long tail on your data, right? So this pie chart on the left shows 8 different values. You can clearly see 4 of them, but there's a handful that are too small to identify. The other thing to notice here is that we have the IP address and we have the percentage, but we don't have the total count. I would make the argument, especially from an analyst perspective, I want the data table all day long. It's much clearer. I can very easily see that, that 3.89 IP address has 21 hits. I would never be able to determine that from the pie chart. Now you might be sitting there and saying, but Ryan, what if there's less values? And I can see where that would be a natural tendency to go with this. And so I have one more example here. This one has 3 values and it's split up. The whole purpose of visualizations, especially graphical ones, is to make it very obvious what's happening with the data without you having to go look at the numbers. That's the whole point of them. Otherwise, everything would just be data tables. I'm going to make the argument, and maybe it's that I'm getting a little bit older, I can barely tell the difference between the size of the green and the size of the blue. Now, after I take a few seconds, sure, I can identify that. I could read on there that one is 42% and one is 37%. But look at that horizontal bar over there on the right. It's just beautiful. You can very easily tell the differences. And then, of course, you have the tried and true data table. So with that said, let's quickly summarize what we went through. We talked about the pillars for dashboard excellence. These should drive all of your decisions. You should strive for consistency across your dashboard so people can build that muscle memory. You should try to get interconnectivity built into these so people can actually navigate from one piece to another without having to go and search for a dashboard. It should all be right there for them. And the last piece is build for scaling in mind. So think about that manageability. Where can I reuse a widget across multiple dashboards so I have one place to update it? As we're building these dashboards, we kind of go hands off of the dashboard and visualizations at first. We start with exploring that data. We really need to understand what fields are available and how we want to break that down. And then we start developing the navigation bar. We build that into a header. We start to bake in some of these filtering into searches or into something further down that allows for scalability, not the visualizations themselves. Last but not least, we build the dashboards, and those are going to be populated with different types of data that's more specific to that dashboard. So fields that are specific to EC2 or IAM or Windows user created, whatever it may be. Along with that, maybe we want to start breaking those down with markdown headers to visually break down that information. Quality of life improvements, hyperlinks. Please use hyperlinks. Most of these Kibana instances or SIEMs are used on the back end instead of the front end. So I know you're pulling that data from a ticketing system or from some other world, right? Make those links, especially internal links, easy. And then anytime you need to link externally, make that easy as well. Build your documentation into your SIEM. That's going to save a ton of time and a ton of questions. And then when you can, include that raw data as close to your dashboard as possible. And last but not least, my ranking corner, avoid inconsistent naming conventions, avoid putting all your data into a single dashboard. And then when you can, figure out if a pie chart is right for you. If it were up to me, I'd say that's very rarely the case. And with that said, I do have a little takeaway here. Phil Hagen built Soft Elk a number of years ago. And the authors of 509, which is the cloud forensics class, leverage that for their course. And so as I was going through that course, I built out a set of dashboards for cloud environments. You can get to that right there, outcloud.checksonbytes.com. Keep in mind, it's a work in progress. You'll notice some of the principles I talked about here were not adhered to in the dashboard set that I have now. I'm in the process of reworking that. But if you want to go see what some of these dashboards look like, you can pull them in and leverage them. Now, keep in mind, back to data normalization, if it's not set up the same way that soft elk is, it may not work for your environment. But with that said, does anyone have any questions?